Thank you for joining me today. It's Brian Gubernick, and welcome to the No Days Off podcast, where we believe that every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. Today, I want to start by revisiting a concept that I've talked about here before, but I want to go a little deeper this time because I think it connects to how some of the greatest builders, the greatest entrepreneurs of our time actually operate. The concept I want to revisit is known as Parkinson's Law. You may remember it. I think it was it was maybe 700 episodes or so ago. I think it was episode 100 or 102, something like that. We covered Parkinson's Law. And you may be familiar, you may have heard it before outside of this podcast. The law is that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. So if you give yourself a month, the job is likely to take a month. If you give yourself a week, then it's likely to take a week. Here's what I've been thinking about lately, though. Some of the most effective leaders that we study as entrepreneurs, individuals like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos. My observation is that they don't just understand this particular idea. I think that they have built an entire operating system around it, or in Jobs' case, he had built it around this concept. Let's start with Jobs. Okay, let's start with Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs had what people around him called a reality distortion field. And that phrase gets tossed around when describing Jobs, but here's what it really meant. It meant that he didn't accept the timeline you gave him. Frankly, he didn't accept anything you gave him. If you told him something was going to take 6 months, he'd say, cool, do it in 6 weeks. If he was told, it can't be done, he'd say, go figure out a way to make it happen. And he didn't do that because he didn't understand the work. He did it because he understood how people behave, especially around time. So when Steve Jobs would compress the timeline, his people would have to only focus on the most important things. They couldn't overthink. They couldn't have unnecessary steps. They had to focus on what actually matters. And Apple's people responded. They'd figure it out. Most of the time, they met Steve's what was perceived as crazy demands. Now, it may not have been perfect. It was probably still really messy, but they'd still get there. Jobs wasn't just demanding. He was forcing teams to operate in a way where Parkinson's Law could not have an impact, where it couldn't take over. Now, let's shift a bit to Elon Musk, because I think Elon, as crazy as Jobs was perceived, I think Elon might even take it further. Because he's known for setting what most people would call completely unreasonable goals. He would set, of course, deadlines that feel incredibly aggressive. Frankly, some of them seem borderline impossible. And a lot of people criticize that approach. But here's what I think it does. It forces a lot more what we'll call first principles thinking. When you don't have the luxury of time, you don't just follow the normal process. You can't. You have to question everything. Do we even need this step? Is there a faster way? What actually matters here? When timelines are long, as traditionally it goes, you have an opportunity or a tendency to want to optimize. But when timelines are short, you have to rethink. That's a big difference. You can't optimize, you have to retool or rethink. And then, of course, there's Jeff Bezos. Now, he comes at it from a completely, maybe not completely, but slightly different angle. Jeff Bezos talked about Amazon being a day one company. What did he mean when he said day one company? It meant that operating with the urgency and the focus and the hunger of a startup, of a company in its day one state, no matter how big you get. Because what happens in day two companies? Things slow down. There's more process, there's more bureaucracy, there's more approvals, more meetings. That's Parkinson's Law at scale. because work expands and time expands and complexity expands. And before you know it, you're busy, but not moving. So Bezos fights all of what I just described there by keeping the mindset of day one, which means move fast, stay very close to the customer, avoid unnecessary layers. It is just another way of resisting that natural drift towards inefficiency. So, what's the connection here? All three of these leaders are doing the same thing in different ways. They're all compressing time in some way. They're refusing to give work more space than it actually needs because they know what happens when you do allow for more space. Now, you don't have to run Apple or Tesla or Amazon for this to matter. This shows up in your day just like mine, and it probably shows up every day. You say things like, I'll make my calls later. I'll follow up later this week. I'll work on that when I have time. And that's how work begins to expand. And that's how things really start to drag. That's frankly how we miss out on opportunities that are right in front of us. Now, if you flip it, what if you took something you've been putting off, for instance, and you cut the timeline in half? So instead of, hey, I'll get to this today, you say, I'm doing this in the next 45 minutes and I'm going to complete it. Or instead of, I'll reach out sometime this week, it's, I'm going to make these 10 calls right now. When you take time and you compress it in the way I just described, watch how your behavior changes. Watch how your teams or your company's behavior changes. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop trying to fill time, and you really, really start to ramp up your execution. The reality is that most people think they need more time. The truth, though, in a lot of cases, they actually need less. Less forces clarity and action. And less time exposes what really actually matters. So here's what I want to encourage you to do today. Pick one thing that's been sitting out there for you. Maybe it's a call that you've been avoiding or a follow-up you've been delaying. Some sort of task that has just been carried out way too long. You've stretched it way too far. Decide how long you think it should take, then cut it in half. Then block the time, set a timer, and go to work. Don't overthink. Don't allow for distractions. Just go and execute. Because at the end of the day, you really don't control how much time you have. You do, however, control how much time you're going to give something. And I think seeing that decision a bit differently really does change the game. That's all I have for you today, the No Days Off podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. So let's get after it.